Dear Distinguished Senate President, submission of the 2022 Appropriation Amendment Proposal. As I indicated at the signing of the 2022 Appropriation Act, I forward here with the proposals for the amendment of the 2022 Appropriation Act as detailed in Schedules 1 to 5 for the current consideration and approval by the Senate. Let me seize this opportunity to once again express my deep gratitude to the leadership and members of the Senate for the expeditious consideration and passage of the 2022 Appropriation Bill, as well as the enabling 2021 Finance Bill. It has become necessary to present this amendment proposal considering the impacts of the recent suspension of the Petroleum Metals Spirit PMS subsidy removal and the adverse implications that some changes made by the National Assembly in the 2022 Appropriation Act could have for the successful implementation of the budget. It is important to restore the provisions made for various key capital projects in the 2022 executive proposal, see details in Schedule 1, that were cut by the National Assembly. This is to ensure that critical ongoing projects that are cardinal to this administration and those nearing completion do not suffer a setback due to reduced funding. It is equally important to reinstate the 25.81 billion naira cut from the provision for the power sector reform program in order to meet the federal government's commitment under the financing plan agreed with World Bank. In addition, it is necessary to reinstate the 4 capital projects totaling 1.42 billion naira in the executive proposal for the Federal Ministry of Water Resources that are removed in the 2022 Appropriation Act. Furthermore, there is critical and urgent need to restore the 3 billion naira cut from the provision made for payment of mostly long outstanding local contractors' debt and other liabilities as part of our strategy to reflect the economy and spur growth. See Schedule 1. You will agree with me that the inclusion of National Assembly's expenditures in the executive budget negates the principles of separation of powers and financial autonomy of the legislature. It is therefore necessary to transfer the National Assembly's expenditures totaling 16.5 billion naira in the service-wide vote to National Assembly's statutory transfer provision. It is also imperative to reinstate the 22 billion naira cut from the provision for sinking fund to retire mature loans to ensure that government can meet its obligations under already issued bonds as and when they mature. The cuts made from provisions for the recurrent spending of Nigeria's foreign missions, which are already constrained, are capable of causing serious embarrassment to the country as they mostly relate to office and residential rentals. Similarly, the reductions in provisions for allowances payable to personnel of the Nigerian Navy and police formations and commands could create serious issues for government. It is therefore imperative that these provisions be restored as proposed in Schedule 2. It is also absolutely necessary to remove all capital projects that are replicated in the 2022 Appropriation Act. 139 out of the 254 such projects totaling 13.24 billion naira have been identified to be deleted from the budget. Some significant and non-mandate projects were introduced in the budgets of the Ministry of Transportation, Office of the Secretary to the Government of the Federation, and Office of the Head of Civil Service of the Federation. There are several other projects that have been included by the National Assembly in the budgets of agencies that are outside their mandate areas. The Ministry of Finance Budget and National Planning has been directed to work with the relevant committees to comprehensively identify and align all such misplaced projects. It is also necessary to restore the title's description of 32 projects in the Appropriation Act to the titles contained in the executive proposal for the Ministry of Water Resources in furtherance of our efforts to complete and put to use critical agenda projects. The appropriation amendment request is for a total sum of 106 billion 499,052 naira only for capital expenditures and 43,870,592,044 naira only for recurrent expenditures. I therefore request the National Assembly to make the above amendments without increasing the budget deficit. I urge you to roll back some of the 887 billion, some of the 887.99 billion naira of projects earlier inserted in the budget by the National Assembly to accommodate these amendments. However, following the suspension of the PMS subsidy removal, the 2022 budget framework has been revised to fully provide for PMS subsidy. An additional provision of 2.557 trillion naira will be required to fund the petroleum subsidy in 2022. Consequently, the Federation account main pool revenue for the three tiers of government is projected to decline by 2 trillion naira, while federal government's share from the account is projected to reduce by 1.05 trillion naira. Therefore, the amount available to fund the federal government budget is projected to decline by 969.09 billion naira. Aggregate expenditure is projected to increase by 45.85 billion naira due to additional domestic debt service provision of 102.5 billion naira net of the reductions in statutory transfers by 56.67 billion naira as follows. NDDC by 12.61 billion naira from 102.78 billion naira to 90.18 billion naira. NEDC by 5.90 billion naira from 48.08 billion naira to 42.18 billion naira. UBEC by 19.06 billion naira from 112.9 billion naira to 93.21 billion naira. Basic Health Care Fund by 9.54 billion naira from 56.14 billion naira to 46.60 billion naira. And NASS by 9.54 billion naira from 56.14 billion naira to 46.60 billion naira. Total budget deficit is projected to increase by 1.01 trillion naira to 7.40 trillion naira, representing 4.01% of GDP. The incremental deficit will be financed by new borrowings from the domestic market. Equally, it is imperative that Clause 10 of the 2022 Appropriation Act, which stipulates that the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC, and the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit, NFIU, are authorized to charge and defray from all money standing in credit to the units as revenues, penalties, or sanctions at 10% for technical setup and operational costs at the units in this financial year be repealed. This clause is in conflict with the Act establishing these agencies, as well as some other laws and financial regulations of the government. These are neither revenue-generating agencies nor regulatory bodies that generate revenue or charge penalty fees. They are fully funded personnel, overhead, and capital by government through budgetary provisions. The Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007, as well as the Finance Act 2021, require that these agencies to remit fully any recovered funds to the Consolidated Revenue Fund. This course may lay a dangerous precedent and spark clamors for similar treatment by other anti-corruption agencies. Also, the Clause 11, which stipulates that notwithstanding the provisions of any other law in force, Nigerian embassies and missions are authorized to expend funds allocated to them under the capital components without having to seek approval of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, should likewise be repealed. It too is inconsistent with the extant financial regulations and the Public Procurement Act, which set thresholds for approving officers and parastatal ministries' tendered boards, for which awards of contracts for the procurement of goods and services. This also amounts to an intrusion of the legislature into what is an executive function. Given the urgency of the request for amendments, I seek the cooperation of the National Assembly for expeditious legislative action on the 2022 Appropriation Amendment proposal in order to sustain the gains of any passage of the budget. Please accept the Single Senate President the assurances of my highest consideration. Yours sincerely, Muhammadu Buhari.